you have to give agency to later periods, and you have to respect the kind of diversity that exists. When you look at the past, there isn't a singular meaning that exists. And if we are going to try to, in the 21st century, we are going to try to recreate an Indian history that is just based on, one reading and one homogeneous kind of framework, we're really ignoring much that exists and the diversity that exists.
This is the Teamwork Arts Podcast's History series in collaboration with Itihāsology. Today we are here with historian Dr. Nayanjot Lahiri. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Lahiri, I want to begin the conversation with your own journey with history. Before we talk about Ashoka and the other territories of the past that you have tapped into, it would be very interesting if you could briefly talk about what made you not only choose the subject, but also stay with it.
So, my journey with history is actually, it began in school. It was a consequence of reading some really interesting books. And then later, during my undergraduate years at St. Stephen's, having some wonderful teachers. So the books I remember reading in school, which made a big impact on me, were books like the work of the Dutch-American historian Hendrik Willem van Loon, The Story of Mankind. I also remember reading, the title eludes me, but it was a book on world history by Eric Wood. But above all, and I went on to work on the Harappan civilization. In school, I read Mulkraj Anand's Maya of Mohenjo-daro. Of course, history was not a subject I did very well in school, but I was interested in it. So I decided to do my undergraduate in history. And at St. Stephen's, we had some wonderful teachers. But the teacher I remember most is Vasudev Chatterjee. Vasudev Chatterjee had just become Dr. Chatterjee. He had returned from Cambridge after getting his doctorate, and he taught us not just modern history with the permanent settlement and the East India Company and all of that, but he also spoke about the fundamentals of history. He recommended some wonderful books to us. And he just made us feel that thinking about the past was really the most interesting and important thing we could do. And of course, from that, doing my master's, I do remember a teacher of political thought called Randhir Singh. He taught two courses on the history of political thought, and he was really consistent and brilliant. Whether he was talking about Machiavelli or Hobbes or Locke, and of course he was a Marxist, so there was Marx and Engels and all of that. So that's where my journey began. But once I started research, a great privilege was to be supervised by Dilip Chakravarti. And I worked on a number of things. I began my research with the inscriptions of Assam. And that was not just because there was a coherent body of inscriptions, but also because it was my sasural. So I always think of my own journey with history as being partly by design, but a lot of it is just, by accident. So I thought that I would be able to look at the landscapes that figure in, the Priyaham inscriptions of Assam, because I would be visiting. So whether it was the great Brahmaputra river or, it was rice cultivation in the rain-drenched plains of Assam, all those things I could see firsthand, and they figure in the inscriptions. But I think, visits to places as you research also helps, because you realize what is there in your evidence can be very different from what you see on the ground. So in Assam, anybody who has visited it would know that it's as much a land of the hills as it is of the plains around the Brahmaputra. But the hills actually figure very rarely in the inscriptions. They're just there in a sacred context. And if you think of habitation, and if you think of cultivation and so on and so forth, which figures in the inscriptions, that doesn't figure in relation to the hills. Now, at the end of this, my supervisor suggested that we do a joint paper on the Assam-Burma route to China. And that's how I went on to do my PhD, because I got so fascinated with looking at routes and how you could historically delineate them, that I decided to then sort of read, breathe, and research trade routes. So that was my training period, the beginning of my journey. And then, of course, I went on to write about other things.
Lovely. Magnificent. And I think, as you say, when you were doing your undergrad at Stephens and getting introduced to these readings, you realized that one of the most interesting things you could do is enter the world of history and to perhaps not only just read it, but question the past, think about the many ways in which we can interpret history. So, and you stuck dominantly with the ancient past. You've done marvelous work when it comes to the Harappan civilization. You've engaged deeply with Ashoka. But one of the things that I have observed as a student of the past is that many perceive histories from the medieval and the modern era to perhaps be more vibrant and multi-layered, whereas the ancient worlds are sometimes unfairly seen as colorless with rigid narratives. Now, a lot of popular writing recently has also been based on the medieval and the modern pasts. But your work has been monumental in shedding light on the fascinating narratives from the ancient past, as I said, be it the Harappan phase or the world and times of Ashoka. So what is your take on this perception that some hold when it comes to the ancient past?
So first, I must correct you. I have actually not felt bound by the boundaries of the ancient and the medieval and the modern. I've actually looked at the modern histories of ancient stuff. So I've looked at the modern history of Sanchi, for example, and the modern, the travails and issues around Bodh Gaya. I've looked at how the 1857 revolt was commemorated, especially in Delhi. But you're quite right that people often think of the ancient, students often think of the ancient as not having, the kind of masala, if you would like to put it that way, as compared to the medieval and modern. And part of the reason might well be that we are looking at a very distant past. And let's say to make anonymous hominins who journeyed, let's say, from, Africa, slowly making their way right up to Tamil Nadu. It takes a lot of skill to actually bring drama into, you can do it, but it's much more difficult than talking about Emperor Akbar, hunting, or, the Sufis singing and so on and so forth. But I think part of the reason may well be that at least the generation, that I and the generation before me, when we looked at books on ancient India, they were not written in an interesting way. And I think that has been one of the, problems with a lot of writings by Indian historians, that they're just excellent when it comes to using, social science techniques. But I don't think enough attention is given to the writing of, history. So that may well be one of the reasons. So when I started writing on the Harappan civilization, I discovered this treasure trove of files in the file room of the Archaeological Survey of India. And I wrote up the first couple of chapters and I sent them to my editor and friend Rukun Advani of Permanent Black. And in a week or so, he just sent them back and he said, when you're talking about something as exciting as finding the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro and piecing together how that civilization was discovered, you can't be addressing just academics. You have to be, looking at a larger audience who is interested in this. So he told me that I should just take a sabbatical from the writings of Indian historians, and I should concentrate on reading good fiction, and he gave me lots of, suggestions on that. And I must say that at first I found it a little difficult, but once you pay a lot of attention to how you communicate what you have read and researched, it becomes easy. And I always tell my students that, you should start doing this very early. I started much later. I started after my PhD was over. And I would have gained a lot if emphasis on good writing was placed quite early.
Absolutely. In the beginning, you mentioned coming across Mulk Raj Anand's Maya Mohenjo-daro. And that was a book. It's a very small graphic novel where it has a few pages. But when you're reading that, you can hear the Harappans talking. You can see them come alive. And I think that's very important, that you need to complement your historical research with other writings to make it more accessible to the general audience. So I remember when in my first year, when we were taught ancient India and Ashoka, and we were recommended Ashoka in ancient India, the same thing what I said for Maya, my professor, Dr. Dayal, said for your work, that when you read Ashoka in ancient India, you can even hear the streets talking, you can hear the inscription come alive. So I think your writing has definitely done that for a lot of students of the ancient past. So thank you for that. But
thank you for reading the work so carefully.
But to connect it with that, I wanted to ask you about history and memory, especially how you deal with it in the context of Ashoka. Now, in Ashoka in ancient India, you have looked at the Greek and Aramaic inscriptions of Ashoka in Afghanistan, and you've talked about the message, the language used, and the translation, and how when you use terms culturally grounded elsewhere, their meanings would have been modified in new lands. And it could be puzzling for the people who are reading it in a new geography, a message that is coming from, well, let's say, the land where Ashoka lives in. So drawing on that, could you shed a bit of light on how complicated the process of studying history is, that it's not just about finding sources such as inscriptions, but deeply reading them, but also in contemporary times, if we were to see, let's say, an Ashokan inscription or an Ashokan pillar at Firozshah Kotla, where neither do you remember Ashoka or the Sultan who brought it to Delhi, but the Latwale Baba. The conversation on the past and what it was intended to sort of convey keeps on changing. I think that's one of the fascinating ways in which history is constantly kept alive. So please shed some light on that.
So Eric, I'll take your second question first. And that's a great example that you've given. And, that actually just underlines something which is so central to historical objects, which is that there is actually a construction history. So, Emperor Ashoka got that pillar created. You can talk about the sculpting, the polish, the fact that, well, the inscription is so high, could people actually have read it from the ground? Did somebody stand there with the, exemplar and read it? Because you can't read it off the pillar. But there is the afterlife, of the pillar as well. And that's actually true for, for a whole lot of places. It is multi-layered. B.N. Goswami before this was talking about an onion and how you peel a layer and then another layer appears and so on and so forth. And I'm presently working in the forests of Bandhavgarh, and there you have these cave shelters which were created in the 2nd century. And they were created by merchants and sometimes by ministers and very rarely by kings. But these were not for religious people. But in the 7th century CE, what happens is that these get repurposed and they become, Shaiv shrines. Similarly, if you go outside Bandhavgarh, there's a village called Kutiala, and Kutiala has this large hemispherical stupa, and that's worshipped today as a Devi Sthan. So, you have to give agency to later periods, and you have to respect the kind of diversity that exists. When you look at the past, there isn't a singular meaning that exists. And if we are going to try to, in the 21st century, we are going to try to recreate an Indian history that is just based on, one reading and one homogeneous kind of framework, we're really ignoring much that exists and the diversity that exists. Now, on the question of Afghanistan, now, as far as Afghanistan is concerned, there are quite a few Ashokan inscriptions there. And I think Ashok may well have sent his message in whichever form he wanted. But his administrators in Afghanistan must have put their heads together and realized that if this is the kind of message that goes, it's not going to appeal to anyone. So they changed the message around. Changed it in the sense they modified it, and they put it within the form that, let's say, people from West Asia, from Persia, for example, were very used to. This was very close, to the areas which were part of the, Achaemenid empire originally. And therefore, there's a much, whereas in the earlier inscriptions, Ashoka is speaking in a tentative way. Here you have Emperor Ashoka speaking with great authority and saying, well, I, have given an order that hunters should not hunt and fishermen should not fish, and they have stopped. Whereas in his earlier inscriptions, there is much more of an appeal that is, made. The inscriptions are also in Aramaic and in Greek. So again, the language of administration is of that area is what is chosen. So, when you look at inscriptions, it's not just what the emperor said, but what is done on the ground that matters. And then how did people receive these inscriptions? So Afghanistan, if you look at the faunal evidence of Afghanistan from the historical period, I mean, people were actually, and continued from prehistoric times onwards, enjoying their meat, And I don't think Ashok's messaging about giving up meat had any impact at all. So constantly you have to juxtapose different kinds of sources. And what you can do with the Ashokan inscriptions is to talk of intent. That this is what Ashok wanted. But did this happen on the ground? That's a larger and much more complex question.
Absolutely. And I think receiving the past, I don't know if you would agree with me on this, but do you think that once you receive the past and you perceive it, it's also a way of personalizing it? So you make sense of history, but you personalize it by giving it a meaning of your own. So just to draw on what we were talking about earlier, I think that the Ashokan pillar at Firozshah Kotla, for it to become the Lat Wale Baba, is the most personal thing that a community can do to make sense of a distant past. So in my opinion, when somebody goes to pray to that Ashokan pillar, they are trying to actually engage with a moment in history that's far away from them. So do you think that exercises like these, where you not only receive the past in a certain way, but you give it a meaning of your own, is an activity and exercise in personalizing history?
Absolutely. And I think what has survived of the past, especially in villages, has survived because it has been integrated into an existing universe of local and folk beliefs. So if you look at the scriptures, if you look at, for example, the Purans and so on and so forth, there are sanctions against the worship of broken images. But on the ground, you can go to any part of India and in the Gram Sthans and in the shrines of the Kheda Devta and the Khedi Dadi and so on and so forth, you will find a whole lot of sculpture that is kept and it is worshipped as a form which is very different from what originally this was. But it has survived there because people worship it in terms of their own belief. And it's not just sculpture. So in the Faridabad area, there's a village called Sihi. And in Sihi, you actually have a place, it's a mound, and in that mound, you get a whole lot of iron ore. Now, whenever you go to Sihi, at least 15 years ago, you found people collecting that. And if you ask them, what is this? They would say, you know, this is used by us as an antidote in poisons. And then you talk around, and that's because, according to local belief, you know, this is where the snake sacrifice of the Mahabharata happened. And these are the bones of those dead snakes. And if you use those bones, you know, it's a kind of antidote to any disease that you have, which, you know, has come from something poisonous that you have imbibed. So, you know, more power to people.
Yes,
it's of course, at the same time, it's something that, let's say, policymakers are very uncomfortable with. So if you were to juxtapose this, for example, with what the archaeological survey would want, the archaeological survey would want everything to be frozen in the time period when it was constructed. So I think there's a tension that exists between how people perceive things on the ground and, you know, what is done in the corridors of government and power.
Definitely. I think this entire debate on what's personal and what's protected keeps on, it is ongoing, and you see that, be it at Firozshah Kotla or Pir Gaya, where time and time again, and all around the world actually, where time and time again authorities would like for things to be frozen in the time that they are from, but people need to make sense of what's around them, and therefore the process of personalization begins. Now, in the beginning you talked about how one of the reasons perhaps that people might not engage with the ancient past in a similar manner in which they do with the medieval and modern phases, because they seem to be more recent, is because it's a distant time. But it is a time with people. It is a time with people who are processing the same sort of emotions, going through the same processes that we do today. They are experiencing love and laughter. That's one of the things that you've talked about in one of your lectures. And these are people who are experiencing love. These are people who are experiencing grief. So maybe shed a bit of light on why study the history of emotions to perhaps get closer to an ancient past, to our ancient past. And maybe you could also talk a bit about one of my favorite inscriptions from the Jogimara caves that you have, that you talked about in your speech on love and laughter and why study it.
So I think emotions need to be studied, because if you look at yourself, emotions matter. How you feel matters. And it has mattered not just in, you know, for looking at the ancient, but it's true across time. So to give you a modern example, if you think of World War I, the way we were taught World War I was, well, you talked about the causes, you talked about the great battles, and then you talked about the Treaty of Versailles, how unfair it was and how it seeded in some way the Second World War. But if you look at the memorializing around those who died, so that's a different thing, and that gives you an insight into grief. So if you just focus for a minute on how many people were killed, so you know, in the Battle of Somme, you had 20,000 people dying in one day. And if you think of the people, let's say in one country, in the UK, how many died, who died? You're looking at very young people who died. Most of them were between 17 and 25. The other thing is their bodies were not shipped home. So, you know, there wasn't a body there for you to grieve over. So the manner in which people who had lost their loved sons and husbands and so on, you know, reacted to this, and the kinds of memorials that came up in many of the villages and small towns of England give you an insight, you know, into emotion in the modern period. So I think emotions matter across time. Now, as far as the ancient is concerned, for me, you know, one of the questions that has always popped up is that when can you speak of the first couple in ancient India, a couple which has a name, you know, there's a woman and a man and they both have names and love is being discussed. So very early, I came across this inscription which is in Chhattisgarh. It's in the Ramgarh hill in a cave which is now called the Jogimara cave. And that mentions a woman called Shutanuka. Shutanuka by name, and it is repeated twice, Shutanuka by name. Devadina, the sculptor, or it could be the painter, loved her. You know, that's it. And she is, Shutanuka is mentioned in the inscription as a Devdasi. So for me, this is actually in some senses a very modern inscription. When you think of ancient India, you think of caste, you know, you think of Varna, you think of Jati. But here is a couple where the woman is mentioned in terms of her profession and her name. That's her identity. So it also gives you an insight into identity. How did people define themselves as against how they were described in these subsets, you know, in the textual sources. And here is this man who is talking about love, and it's a love which is a sexual love, because the word used is based on kam. So, you know, from that, to look at, you know, that was my starting point, to go across time and look at the, you know, the way in which love and love making is described in the sources is actually absolutely fascinating. Definitely. So, you know, the Kama Sutra, for example, is often used to talk about titillation. But actually there is so much attention paid by the author to satisfying a woman's sexual desire that, you know, it makes you think that, well, there were men who actually thought of this, you know, in ancient India. There's also a marital love that can figure in the sources. There is, of course, romantic love. And of course, there are other emotions you can recover. So I was interested in laughter too. And one of the things that struck me was that if you look at how the Buddha is imaged, you know, this great man, perhaps among the greatest ancient Indians, certainly, that we have had. And you think about him, he looks so somber. You will never see him smiling. And on the other hand, if you look at some of the sculpture that is there in the Mathura Museum, you will, you know, you will find a woman sort of, after having had a glass of wine, sort of laughing, and, you know, there's a man holding on to her and holding on to grapes and so on and so forth. And then you ask yourself a larger question, that were people who were very important meant to look somber and dignified, because that's what happens in Rome. So in Rome, if you look at the way in which the senators are depicted in all those hundreds of busts that you have, they all look very serious and grave. Nobody seems to be having a good time. And on the other hand, you look at the mosaics in Pompeii, and it's there that you find fun and laughter and so on and so forth. So, you know, looking at themes like this, and talking of the Buddha, if you look at Southeast Asia, you have the laughing Buddha. So obviously every culture has its own way of depicting the, you know, the same persona.
Yes. Also talking about the Buddha, I remember in our classes in ancient India, we'd be talking about looking at those sculptures of Buddha from Gandhara with a moustache and with certain different characteristics where the face changes from one sculpture to another. So I think it's truly fascinating to read these faces and to read a history of emotions of love and laughter, because I think they reveal a history of existence. And a lot of times when people hear about these things, they are stunned in a way where they either say, oh, ye tab bhi hota tha, Or they would say something which is very unfair to history, I think, oh, they were ahead of their times, which I feel is giving a lot of importance to the present and the future, and not giving the past its due right. And I think in the specific case of Harappa, where I believe that they are not believe, they are still silenced, we don't know what they're actually saying. Because of that, I think numerous people perceive the Harappan past as very limited in the sense of their understanding it till what extent can you go to actually understand Harappans. But I think that the very fact that the inscriptions are still silenced gives you more room to create these imaginative possibilities, even maybe talk about histories of love making and emotions in a past that is so distant, that comes from prehistory, so from the bronze civilization. So what do you think about the silenced Harappans and the possibilities that come with an inscription that we can't read?
So as far as the Harappan inscriptions go, it's really a pity they haven't been deciphered. Yes. There are more than 4,000 inscriptions, but because we are looking at inscriptions where the average length of an inscription is just 6 characters and the longest inscription is 24 characters, and there isn't you know, a biscriptural inscription or a triscriptural inscription, we don't know what they say. But what we do know is that many of the inscriptions were written from right to left. We do know that many of the inscriptions must be the names of people, because you will find them, for example, on amulets and so on and so forth. But beyond, I think one thing that many historians, unlike a lot of people who love history but, you know, might feel that it's too formidable to approach on their own from the sources, I think we historians and archaeologists realize that there are other ways to tease out information. So, for instance, if you go to Dholavira has the first public hoarding in the world. There is this inscription, the letters of which must have been fixed to a board where the material has disintegrated, but the letters have survived, and it was found flat on the ground in front of a gateway. And surely it must be identifying the elite area, you know, from where people used to come down to what is, you know, a kind of common, you know, ground for meetings and events and so on and so forth. So, you know, context does matter in such situations. But in the case of the Harappans, I think everybody in India sees their, you know, progenitors as being Harappan. I find it strange that nobody thinks of Africa when they think about their ancestors, because we all actually came out of Africa, and everybody thinks of the Harappans. And that may well be because so many elements that you associate even with life today. You can see their cities, for instance, you know, a diversity of elite groups. Also, the beginnings, I would say, of manual scavenging. So, if you think of Harappan cities, you have to think about, you know, the drains and the bathrooms inside the houses, who cleaned them, who maintained them, what do we know about, you know, those histories, how much has this changed over time. So from the Harappans, if you go to the Dharma Shastras, nobody ever in the Dharma Shastras, I'm sure people did it, but the point is, according to the Dharma Shastras, you know, if you wanted to do anything, you had to go out of the settlement, and the ground had to be soft. So, you know, cultural mores change, practices change, and I think the Harappans in that sense were far more civilized, and there's much in common, you know, in having bathrooms and drains and so on and so forth, as compared to what happened later on. But our cultural practices, which of course the, you know, the campaigns by the government has been trying to address, But culturally, our practices are much more. There are two kinds of, you know, toilet people all over the world. There are washers and there are wipers. And we were the washers. We always used water. And that's something that is mentioned in the Dharma Shastras, but it had to be done outside.
Yes.
So, you know, the average person who goes and craps near a railway track is actually following a very good Dharma Shastra practice. But that's not the reason why they ought to do it at all.
Yeah. And I think I'd like to highlight that point about the drainage systems and the houses, because this is something you've talked about before. Yes, excellent drainage systems. The urban planning of Mohenjo-daro is something that we are talked about, that we are taught again and again throughout our school years. But one thing that we must question is who was building these houses, who was maintaining these houses, who was maintaining the drains. And I think that's something that really provides you room to think about beyond what you see and beyond what you perceive. Before we end this conversation, I wanted to talk to you about your recent book. Your recent book has examined how Ashoka has been remembered and recast over time across countries. So I wanted to know how this experience was for you of traveling and finding Ashoka in places that you might have not expected to. And do you think that this traveling has opened more rooms for you to imagine the past in you know, more colorful ways?
So I think as far as traveling with Ashoka goes, when I did my first book, Ashoka in Ancient India, I actually found that he was an extraordinarily cerebral man. You know, those are unique inscriptions. You don't find them, that doesn't become a kind of prototype for any ruler after that. So he himself has thought about life and compassion and governance and how to make governance more compassionate very, very carefully. Now, once I finished that book, I think within a few months, I really started missing him. And by then, I had got this offer from Ashoka University. And when I joined Ashoka University, we get a faculty grant annually to do the research that we want. So I thought, why not follow the remembrance of Ashoka? This is something I hinted at in the last chapter, in the epilogue of Ashoka in Ancient India, that there's a book waiting to be written, actually several books, as I now realize, on how Emperor Ashoka was remembered. Now, once I started searching for the remembrance of Ashoka, what I found was, and this is true not just for Ashoka, it's true for ancient and medieval and modern figures, there's a big difference between the historical persona and what is remembered. Remembrance is always selective. You know, if you look at what psychologists have talked about, if a story is told to 10 of us and we are asked to recount it within half an hour of that, we will each recount it differently because our own ideas, our own experiences, you know, come into play when we do that. Now, in the case of Emperor Ashoka, so I traveled to many places in India. So in Sanchi, for example, Emperor Ashoka, you know, put up this big brick stupa. And he also put up a pillar there, a pillar which has a very admonitory message, telling the Sangha that, you know, if there is Sangha Bheda, that there is a strife within the Sangha, and if divisions are created, people will be thrown out of the Sangha and they would have to wear white robes and so on. So I'm sure the Sangha is anonymous. You don't hear of the Sangha there in terms of actual people, but it's Emperor Ashoka who is giving this message in a place, obviously, of Buddhist worship and residence. Now later, when, you know, the stupa is enlarged and elaborated, you have actually Emperor Ashoka being imaged there in the sculptures. And in those sculptures, actually, Ashoka is shown as a mere mortal. He can't prevent his queen Pisha Rakshita from actually mortally harming the Bodhi tree. He cannot persuade the Nagas in Ramagrama to actually open out the stupa. He opens out all the other stupas, but he doesn't succeed in Ramagrama. They actually defend it and tell him that this can't be open. So the Sangha, you know, who's been given this lesson by Ashoka, is actually coming back and telling him that, look, don't think you are the Buddha and you can preach to us. You too are a mere mortal. Now, if you go beyond India, and if you look at Sri Lanka, for instance, what I found in Sri Lanka was that he's remembered as a king, but he's remembered most often as a father. And that's because his son, you know, Mahinda, he actually formally converts Devanam-Piyatissa, the king. And it is his daughter Sangamitta, who is also a nun, who actually carries the Bodhi tree, a branch of the Bodhi tree, all the way to Sri Lanka, and that branch and branches from that over time, you know, are there all over, but most famously in Anuradhapura. Now, Ashoka himself doesn't mention either Mahinda or Sangamitta in his epigraphs, but he's remembered as the father of his children in Sri Lanka. Wow. If you look at, let's say, Southeast Asia, the story which for me is the most striking comes from South Thailand. So in South Thailand, in a place called Nakhon Si Thammarat, you actually have an entire dynasty named after him. So these are Dhamma Asokas. And in the chronicle around this dynasty, you hear about the fact that there were relics of the Buddha that had been buried, which the king of Nakhon Si Thammarat had forgotten about. But at some point, he gets a missive from the Ashoka of India. It says, you know, it talks of the middle country, the Madhya Desh. And this Ashoka, our Ashoka, has actually made all these stupas, but he doesn't have relics to enshrine in them. So he's begging for these relics, and it's very embarrassing because the king doesn't know where the relics are, but eventually he gets a Brahmin who identifies the place. The relics then some of them are sent to Ashoka. Now, on the other hand, if you look at ancient texts, it is Emperor Ashoka always who is opening stupas and redistributing relics. And here, on the other hand, he has become a supplicant seeking relics from a Thai Buddhist king. So, you know, there are reasons you cherry pick the past when you remember, and you do it in ways that matter to your own, you know, cultural value. That's also true for Nehru. So Prime Minister Nehru was, I mean, as I think most people know, a great admirer of Emperor Ashoka, and that's, you know, one of the reasons why, it's not the only reason why, you know, the Sarnath pillar capital becomes the symbol of independent India, as it were. But if you look at the Sarnath pillar capital and you look at the inscription, it is for Buddhists. But here is the first Prime Minister of India who transforms it into something which is a message about all of India. And then you have a historian, Vasudev Sharan Agrawal, who writes a book on the Dharma Chakra and shows that actually the chakra is common to all religious traditions. I think in all this, what was forgotten was that as far as Ashoka was concerned and the Sarnath pillar was concerned, the message was a deeply Buddhist message.
Yes, yes. Fascinating. Thank you so much, Dr. Lahiri, for not only peeling the many layers of history, but also for bringing what we said in the beginning of the conversation, a distant past, much closer to us. Thank you so much for being in conversation with me.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, subscribe to our channel now. We have a new episode out every Friday.